I should say up front that for a video about General Mills, there will be surprisingly little cereal talk. I'm gonna keep it to an absolute minimum and instead talk about everything else they've done over the years, which I think is way more than you would expect. I can almost guarantee that you're gonna be surprised by something that I say in this video, if not almost everything. The roots of the company go back to 1866, and here's a good question. Do you know the first ever cereal introduced by General Mills? You might think that it's Cheerios, but it was actually Wheaties. They came out in 1924, meaning the company that became General Mills existed for over 50 years before ever selling cereal, and for over 70 years before selling Cheerios. Before that, it was all about flour. I think most people have used or at least seen Gold Medal flour. It's been one of the top brands going back to the 1800s. It's put out by General Mills and is the thing that started this massively diverse company. See, this guy named Washburn started this flour mill in Minneapolis, and then 3 years later, this guy named Pillsbury started a competing flour mill in the same city. That competition was good for the industry. The great Washburn-Pillsbury milling rivalry, as I like to call it, led to technological advances and turned Minneapolis into the flour milling capital of the country. Then in 1880, Cincinnati was hosting the first International Millers Exhibition. As part of it, Washburn entered his flour into their contest, and it won the gold medal. Now, that may have turned into one of the most publicized gold medals in history, because soon after, the victory motivated him to adopt the name Gold Medal as the brand of his flour. So the company that we all associate with breakfast cereals did not start that way. In fact, when Wheaties was introduced, their original name was much lengthier. It was called Washburn's Gold Medal Whole Wheat Flakes, meaning that there was a time when they were so well known for their flour that they felt it was almost necessary to associate it with any other products that they developed. I should mention that General Mills was officially formed in 1928, when Washburn's company was merged together with 27 other smaller mills from around the country. The idea was that they can all continue operating the same as before, but then they would have the benefit of centralized product development and advertising. That leads me to the next one, which may be a little more unexpected: a radio station. In 1924, there was a struggling radio station out of Minneapolis called WLAG. It was forced to shut down and then saved when it was bought by the company that would become General Mills. At that time, they were called Washburn Crosby Company, named after the founder and an early partner. So to help advertise the brand, they changed the call letters to WCCO to represent Washburn Crosby Company. They called themselves the Gold Medal Station to promote their brand of flour, and it just seemed like a great way to grow and diversify while better promoting their business. If you remember, Wheaties was first sold the same year they bought this radio station. So in 1926, they started promoting it by airing one of the first ever jingles sung by the once famous Wheaties Quartet. Won't you try Wheaties? The sales for the cereal were noticeably higher in the areas that got the radio station, suggesting that the whole effort was effective, and I would go as far as to say that without it, we may not have Wheaties or any other General Mills cereals today. They did sell the station in 1932 to CBS for the price of $450,000, and it still exists today. In Minneapolis, it's on AM radio, frequency 830, and it's on TV, CBS Channel 4, still labeled as WCCO, and that's where those letters come from. Next up is mechanics. This one had a logical start, but quickly blew up into something bigger. The department was formed to support their flour manufacturing, intended to maintain the machinery and develop new things to make the operations more efficient. They developed this glue that would seal the packages, and then this machine that would automatically fill up the bags to the appropriate amounts. But then in the 1940s, during World War II, they switched their focus to help produce various equipment for the US Navy. When the war ended, they continued working with the government on these hot air balloon projects. That's also when they started producing electronics and appliances for consumers. There was in existence at one point a General Mills toaster and an iron. That part actually never did too well. It's considered to be one of their few failures. So in the early 1960s, they sold it. Then they used that money to get involved in other businesses. In the 1960s, they made 37 acquisitions, most of which were for companies that you would not expect. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, believe it or not, General Mills was one of America's largest largest toy makers. They did it almost entirely through these acquisitions, essentially skipping from one industry to another. In 1965, they bought Rainbow Crafts, which is not a well-known name, but it was significant because they were the makers of Play-Doh. 2 years later, they bought Kenner Products, which is another name that you may not know, but they were famous for their spirograph and the Easy Bake Oven. I mean, this is just the stars aligning. Here we have a product that crosses over between toys and food, and they used that opportunity to rebrand it as the Betty Crocker Easy Bake Oven. And Betty Crocker is another brand that they own. I'll get to it in a minute. Still with the toys and games, in 1968, the following year, they bought Parker Brothers, which among other things gave them the rights to possibly the most famous board game of all time, Monopoly. Also, not long after the acquisition, Parker Brothers created the Nerf ball. So anytime you see a Nerf product, just know that that was originated under the ownership of General Mills. There's more. In 1970, they bought the licensing rights to make and sell Lionel trains. It keeps going, but the point here is that they were determined to become a big name in toys, which they did to a point where it became a third of their entire business. Then in 1985, they wanted to get back to basics, focus more on their food, so they put all of this stuff together and spun it off into its own separate company called Kenner Parker Toys. For the next one, we have to go back a minute. Happening almost concurrently with their sudden burst into toys was their sudden burst into fashion. I know, General Mills and fashion are not typically associated, but they became a big part of that industry. It started in 1968 when they bought Monocraft Products, who were the makers of Monet jewelry. The next year, they bought David Crystal, the makers of Lacoste clothing. 2 years later, they bought Eddie Bauer, and then it was Talbot's, and then FootJoy. I don't know what to say about this one, but they were once the owner of all of these major fashion brands that we still see today. But remember, by 1985, they were getting back to basics, back to the foods, so they started selling off all of it, and by 1988, they had successfully divested completely from the fashion industry. Alright, we're gonna have to go back again, because this was when they were really divesting. It was into toys, into fashion, and into restaurants. General Mills, at the same time, once owned two of the largest restaurant chains in the United States. In 1970, when there was only 3 of them, General Mills bought Red Lobster. At this point, I'm sure nothing that they do surprises you, but it was likely a response to their longtime rival Pillsbury, who had just bought the fast food chain Burger King 3 years earlier. And they did make various attempts at opening other restaurants the following years, but the one that stuck was the Olive Garden. Now remember, in 1985, they were looking to refocus back on food, but this was food, so they held on to them through the shift and all the way until 1995. That is when the 2 national chains, along with a few other smaller ones, were spun off into their own company. At that time, they had 715 Red Lobsters and 477 Olive Gardens. I think we can say General Mills is the reason that these restaurants turned into what they became. Alright, since they kept divesting and narrowing their market until they were left with essentially consumer foods, that's the last thing that I want to talk about. When you go to the grocery store, you may think that General Mills products are limited to that cereal aisle. Well, that is not true. I would bet that they either currently own or have once owned something in just about every section. I'll talk about some of the more notable ones. Betty Crocker. I mentioned this before with the Easy Bake Ovens. This is a major food brand owned by General Mills, based around a fictional character that was created by General Mills. It's too easy to get sidetracked with this one, but the company created her as a means to respond to people's questions about their products. You know, you'd write in with a question, and when they wrote back, it would be in her voice. She functioned very well as an advertising mascot through radio shows, commercials. In the 1940s, they introduced her cake mix that you could still buy today. They used her branding on other products, and it became an effective way to sell their stuff. In 1931, I want to mention they came out with Bisquick. Moving ahead a bit, in the 1960s, when they were going crazy with all these acquisitions, they were also getting big into snack foods. They were buying all these chip companies. They bought a nut company. They bought Gorton's, you know, the frozen fish company with the Gordon's Fishermen. They bought it in 1968, sold it in 1995. Very similar to what happened with Red Lobster. There's just so many here. In 1971, they started Hamburger Helper, and then Tuna Helper, and whatever other kinds of helpers there are. In 1975, they introduced Nature Valley. In 1977, they bought the US rights to the yogurt brand Yoplait from a French company. Today, they own the majority of it. In 1985, they started the brand Pop Secret for microwave popcorn, which was later sold in 2008 for $190 million. In 1997, after an extended history of dozens dozens of acquisitions, they made one larger than any of those when they bought RelCorp Holdings for $570 million. It gave them the ownership of Cookie Crisp, Chex Cereal, Chex Mix, along with some other brands, but that's going to look like nothing compared to what happened in 2000. Are you ready for this? That year, General Mills actually bought Pillsbury. Remember the big Pillsbury rivalry? Well, I think it officially ended here because they came together. In the end, it was valued at something like $10 billion, which included the assumption of $4.5 billion in debt. I made a different video that talks about Pillsbury over the years, and if you watch that one and see it from the other side, I think you'll better understand the significance of this. The deal gave General Mills control of many of the Pillsbury branded products, in addition to all these other brands that they had accumulated, including Green Giant Vegetables and Progresso Soup. Just to bring all of this together, I want to conclude with a list of some of the major brands that General Mills has been involved with. Here we go. I'm going to try to do it in one breath. Gold Medal Flour, WCCO Radio Station, Play-Doh, Spirograph, Easy Bake Oven, Monopoly, Nerf, Lionel Trains, Monet Jewelry, Lacoste Clothing, Eddie Bauer, Talbot's, FootJoy, Red Lobster, Olive Garden, Betty Crocker, Bisquick, Gorton's, Hamburger Helper, Nature Valley, Yoplait, Pop Secret, Pillsbury, Green Giant, Progresso. And that is nowhere near a complete list, just the ones that are more significant or that stand out to me. And that list did not include any cereal brands. I just talked about General Mills for all of this time without even mentioning Lucky Charms, except for their... Let me know in the comments, did I honor my guarantee? Were you at least surprised by something in this video, if not all of it? If so, which part was the most unexpected? I also want to say that this is not even everything. They've been involved in furniture, they had a chemical unit, pet food, ice cream, fruit snacks. It's too much. I tried to stick to the bigger, more shocking ones, but there are more. Annie's Homegrown is another one. Alright, I'll stop. Finally, I don't want to discount the breakfast cereals. That's been a huge part of their business. They've created some of the most popular brands with the most well-known mascots. So let me know if you'd like to see another video focusing on that end of things. But until then, any thoughts about General Mills and the wide variety of things that I talked about today, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.